The photograph arrived in a crumpled envelope, its edges frayed, and the corners curled with age. At first glance, it seemed harmless, almost charming, a portrait of a family frozen in the gentle rigidity of 1880s formality. Two small children stood side by side, clutching the hands of their parents, their faces faintly smiling beneath the formal glare of the camera's lens. There was nothing extraordinary in the symmetry of their poses, the neatness of their attire, or the soft sunlight that spilled across the faded backdrop. Yet something had drawn the restorer's eye to it, a subtle tension that defied the photograph's apparent innocence. When the careful work of restoration began, faint smudges and hidden lines emerged, forming shapes that had been invisible for over a century. Shadows flickered where no shadows should have been, and the twins' expressions, once innocent and placid, seemed to warp under the lens of enhancement. It was as if the photograph had been holding its breath, preserving a truth too heavy to reveal until now. A sorrow threaded into the very fibers of the image. The more the restoration progressed, the more the scene transformed. The parents' hands, once tender, seemed to clutch at something unseen, and the twins' eyes, small mirrors of something forgotten, held a grief that no words could explain. By the time the image was fully restored, the simple family portrait had become something else entirely, a frozen whisper of tragedy, a silent witness to a sorrow that had lain dormant for decades, waiting patiently to be remembered. It began with a faint smell of dust and age, the kind that clings to objects long forgotten in attics and basements, waiting patiently for discovery. Among piles of yellowed newspapers, cracked leather, bound books, and forgotten trinkets, the photograph emerged almost accidentally. It had been tucked inside a thin envelope, its edges frayed and worn, the paper brittle enough to tear with the slightest touch. Whoever had placed it there so many decades ago had left it like a secret, a fragment of memory deliberately hidden, or perhaps simply misplaced. The surface of the photograph was dull with the passage of time, coated in a film of grime that obscured the finer details. Yet beneath that layer, there was something that demanded attention, something that called quietly to whoever might chance upon it. It was the kind of photograph that initially seemed simple, ordinary even, yet the kind that lodges in the mind, insisting that its story be told. When the photograph was first handled, it seemed almost like any other family portrait from the late 19th century. The edges were uneven, slightly curled, and the corners were soft from years of handling. But the image itself remained remarkably intact considering its age. In the photograph, two children stood between their parents, perfectly poised in the stiff, formal posture demanded by early photographic technology. Their small hands clutched those of their parents, fingers entwined in a gesture that suggested comfort and familial unity. The parents, dressed in the somber, carefully tailored fashions of 1880, stood like sentinels beside their children, their expressions serious yet not unkind. Their eyes fixed in the direction of the camera with the faintest suggestion of pride. The children, twin siblings, mirrored each other's poses, a symmetry that added a delicate balance to the scene. At first glance, there seemed to be nothing unusual. There were no obvious signs of distress, no misplaced objects in the frame, no eerie figures lurking in the background. Just a family preserved in a fleeting moment of time, captured in the precision and gravity of early photography. Yet as the photograph changed hands, moving from the estate sale to the careful touch of restoration experts, that initial simplicity began to unravel. Experts who had spent their careers reviving images from the brink of invisibility noted something almost imperceptible at first. The twins' eyes, small and round, seemed to contain shadows, Tiny variations in the grayscale that might have been dismissed as flaws in the photographic plate were now drawing attention. There was a subtle asymmetry to their expressions, a tension in the curve of their mouths that didn't quite align with the placid appearance of the parents. The restorer leaned closer, adjusting magnifying lenses, tilting the photograph under soft light, noting minute variations in the surface texture. The more carefully the image was examined, the more it revealed its secrets. Lines and smudges that once seemed accidental were now forming patterns. Patterns that hinted at something beneath the visible surface, as if the photograph itself were holding back, resisting its own clarity, delaying its revelation of the truth it contained. The discovery of the photograph set off a ripple of curiosity. Its provenance was initially unclear. The estate sale, where it had been found, revealed little beyond the basic facts. The house had belonged to a family long gone, heirs unaware of the volume of personal effects left behind. No records detailed the identity of the family in the photograph, and there were no notes, no inscriptions, nothing that could immediately anchor it in history. Yet the photograph spoke in its own language, subtle but insistent, demanding that its story be uncovered. Those who examined it felt an uncanny sense that the family's moment, frozen in time, was more than mere portraiture. Something lingered within the stillness of the scene, something that seemed almost alive, as though the photograph had absorbed not just the likenesses of those captured, but the emotions and secrets of the moment itself. The twins, small and identical, were the most captivating element. Their symmetry drew the eye, but it was their faces that held a quiet dissonance. Beneath the polite, composed exterior expected of children in formal portraits, there was an undercurrent of something unspoken, a subtle misalignment in the tilt of the head, the faint, almost imperceptible tightness of the jaw. The parents, though calm and collected in demeanor, had their own anomalies, subtle variations in shadow and contrast, that became more evident as restoration proceeded. Initially invisible to the untrained eye, these nuances hinted that the photograph might contain more than the simple, idyllic scene it appeared to portray. The photograph also possessed an aura that went beyond technicalities. When viewed in isolation, without the knowledge of the family's identity or history, it carried a peculiar weight, an almost imperceptible tension that made observers pause, glance again, and sense that the ordinary might conceal the extraordinary. It was a moment suspended in time, yet somehow aware of its own preservation, as if the camera had captured not just physical likenesses, but the emotional atmosphere surrounding them. The careful hands of the restorer, guided by years of experience, began to pick away at the layers of dust, dirt, and aging chemicals on the surface, revealing hints of what lay beneath. Every brush stroke, every application of cleaning solution and gentle polish became an excavation, peeling back not only the physical layers, but the invisible layers of memory and feeling, drawing the observer closer to a truth that had been hidden for generations. The excitement and unease intertwined. A photograph, after all, is more than an image. It is a repository of time, a fragile bridge between the past and the present. The initial discovery marked the beginning of a journey, one that would uncover not just the technical or historical aspects of the photograph, but the emotional and spectral residue embedded within it. The very act of discovery transformed the photograph from a forgotten artifact into a living enigma, a puzzle demanding attention, analysis, and interpretation. It was a reminder that even the simplest, most seemingly innocent images can hold stories far more complex and poignant than one might ever anticipate, and that sometimes the quietest discoveries have the power to disturb, captivate, and haunt those who dare to look closer. The moment the restoration work truly began, the photograph seemed to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. At first, the changes were so minor that they could be dismissed as tricks of light, the natural quirks of an aged emulsion, or the vagaries of the human eye. The shadows behind the family were deeper than one might expect, edges darker and more pronounced when the photo was held at certain angles. The twins' small, innocent faces, once appearing symmetrical and serene, now seemed to carry the faintest traces of strain, as though some unspoken emotion had been captured by the camera without the conscious knowledge of those standing before it. The restorer worked meticulously, wiping away decades of grime and dust with soft brushes and careful solutions. Yet with each stroke, it felt as though the photograph was slowly revealing secrets it had kept hidden for more than a century. As the layers of dirt were lifted, faint outlines emerged in the background that had previously been invisible. At first, they were dismissed as imperfections in the paper, irregularities from the photographic process, but closer examination revealed shapes that seemed deliberate. A shadow here, a blur there, figures that were not fully formed, yet undeniably present, moving in a space just behind the family, observing, waiting. The twins, still gripping their parents' hands, now seemed less composed. Their eyes, once placid and wide, held something else entirely too subtle. Sorrowful awareness, as if they sensed an unseen presence in the room. It was a look that seemed impossibly mature for children of their age, a haunting premonition caught in an instant, frozen forever by the camera lens. The restorer, who had dealt with hundreds of images from the late 19th century, paused more than once, adjusting lenses, squinting, leaning closer to detect the anomalies that refused to resolve into ordinary flaws. The edges of the parents' clothing, the folds of their sleeves, even the lace and embroidery that framed their faces seemed to ripple subtly, giving the impression of movement within the stillness. And behind them, almost imperceptibly, the background was no longer a simple wall or studio backdrop. Shapes emerged that resembled figures standing too close, figures that could not have been noticed in 1880 without the extraordinary sensitivity of modern restoration techniques. It was as though the photograph had absorbed more than the visible scene, capturing echoes of a presence that existed outside the frame, just beyond the reach of ordinary perception. The twins' eyes became the most unnerving aspect of the unearthed image. Tiny imperfections in the photograph, once regarded as trivial artifacts, now appeared as faint, vertical shadows within their irises, like reflections of something behind the camera, something not meant to be seen. Their gaze, fixed forward, suggested awareness of an invisible reality. The parents' faces, meanwhile, seemed to hold a quiet resignation. Their expressions, previously read as prideful and gentle, now carried a subtle tension, the strain of emotions barely perceptible to the naked eye, but impossible to ignore under magnification. It was as if the family had posed for the photograph, knowing that the moment captured was fleeting, knowing that something sad or tragic would follow, something that the camera had anticipated and recorded long before the world knew it. Curiosity soon grew into an obsessive fascination. Historians, photographers, and amateur investigators who examined the photograph were struck by the unnatural feeling it evoked. They found themselves returning again and again, eyes tracing the faint contours that had emerged from the restoration process. Each visit brought new details, the suggestion of a hand just behind one of the twins' shoulders, a shadow shaped like a small figure crouching or reaching out, and the subtle distortion in the twins' expressions, which seemed to shift depending on the angle of light or the observer's distance. None could say for certain whether these details were mere artifacts of an old, photographic process, or something far more deliberate, something imbued with memory, grief, or lingering presence. The unearthed elements of the photograph seemed to tell a story that had long been buried, a story the family could not articulate, yet one that the camera had unwillingly recorded. The quiet tension in the twins' posture suggested more than a simple children's pose. It hinted at anticipation, anxiety, or even a foreshadowed loss. The parents' hands, firmly holding their children, now seemed not just protective but desperate, as if trying to anchor the children against something unseen. Every detail, once mundane, had acquired significance: the tilt of a head, the placement of a hand, the angle of a foot. Each element contributed to a narrative of unease, a subtle unraveling of what had initially appeared as a wholesome, ordinary family portrait. By the time the photograph was fully unearthed, the room in which it was examined felt charged with a strange atmosphere. The restorer, alone in the quiet studio, with only the faint hum of equipment, experienced moments where the twins' eyes seemed to follow movement in the room. The shadows behind the parents and children appeared more pronounced when glanced at peripherally, almost as if they shifted ever so slightly in response to attention. Those who had worked on the image reported a palpable sensation of sorrow and absence, a weight that seemed to radiate from the paper itself. It was as though the photograph, through the meticulous work of restoration, had begun to breathe again, revealing what it had preserved in secret for decades. Traces of grief, hints of tragedy, and perhaps even a presence that defied explanation. With every additional detail brought into focus, the story suggested by the photograph grew darker. The family no longer appeared isolated within a simple studio backdrop. They seemed poised within a moment of awareness, aware of something beyond the frame. The twins' expressions, the subtle movements in the shadows, the tension in the parents' posture, all coalesced into an unsettling tableau that hinted at a reality far removed from the picture's original appearance. What had once been charming and mundane now radiated unease, and those who encountered the photograph began to sense that its unearthing was more than a technical achievement. It was an awakening, a revelation of truths hidden in plain sight, truths that the photograph had held tightly for more than a century, waiting for the moment when someone would finally see as the photograph revealed more of its hidden details. Curiosity turned into determined research. The family in the image could not remain nameless forever. The restorer, along with a historian who had been consulted for context, began digging through old records, census data, and local archives. At first, the search seemed like a routine task, the kind of genealogical work that usually produced only mundane facts: birth dates, marriage certificates, addresses. But almost immediately, small inconsistencies began to emerge. The twins, the historian discovered, were mentioned only briefly in passing in local records, their existence noted in an old birth registry with no subsequent mentions in family histories or diaries. The parents were traceable for a few years after the photograph was taken, yet then they disappeared from public documentation entirely, as if the family had evaporated from the world, leaving only the photograph behind as evidence that they had ever existed. The sense of disappearance, so often invoked in ghost stories or tragic tales, seemed here rooted in reality, adding a layer of unease to the already unnerving visual evidence from the restored photograph. The historian's research uncovered the first true clue: an old newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle with age, tucked into a local archives collection of late 19th century announcements. It mentioned the sudden illness and death of one of the twins, a detail that had been overlooked in genealogical surveys because the child's life had been so brief. There were no photographs, no detailed obituaries, just a small paragraph noting that a child had passed unexpectedly. A sentence that carried neither explanation nor context, as if the tragedy had been treated as an unfortunate yet common occurrence. The discovery of this clipping reframed the photograph entirely. What had initially seemed like a cheerful, innocent family portrait now took on a new meaning. The sorrow lurking in the twins' eyes, the subtle tension in the parents' posture, and the faint, ghostly outlines emerging in the background could no longer be dismissed as coincidental imperfections or quirks of early photography. Perhaps the photograph had been capturing grief the family could not articulate, emotions so raw and pervasive that they left a mark on the very material of the image. Further investigation revealed more disquieting elements. Letters written by neighbors or family friends, preserved in private collections, hinted at a sequence of events that was never officially recorded. References to a sudden disappearance of one twin, vague mentions of a shadow that followed the child, or illness that could not be named, painted a picture of a family grappling with unspoken horrors. There were accounts of the surviving twin showing signs of distress, staring into corners, murmuring words that adults could not understand, and of the parents themselves appearing more haggard than the photograph suggested. These documents, though fragmentary and inconsistent, created a tapestry of unease, confirming that tragedy had indeed struck the family. Each piece of evidence lent weight to the unsettling details revealed in the restoration, blurring the line between the literal and the spectral. As the story of the family began to coalesce from the historical record, the photograph gained new significance. It was no longer merely a record of faces and clothing. It became a repository of memory, grief, and perhaps even lingering presence. The historian noted that the timing of the photograph was especially important. The image had been taken only days before the twins' sudden disappearance, an era when photographic portraits were still rare and expensive, often reserved for the most significant moments in a family's life. That this moment captured so much more than intended suggested a depth to early photography that modern observers rarely considered. The camera had done more than preserve likenesses. It had inadvertently recorded the invisible, capturing the weight of an unspoken tragedy in a single frame. The unearthed clues also hinted at the local community's reaction to the events. While the newspapers and letters were discreet, they suggested whispers and speculation that the family's sorrow was known but largely ignored, a private grief hidden behind polite social norms. There were faint suggestions that neighbors remembered seeing shadows in the house or hearing cries late at night. Anecdotes that might have been dismissed at the time as the overactive imagination of children or the misperceptions of those living nearby. Yet the consistency of these reports, when examined in conjunction with the photograph, suggested otherwise. The image had recorded something beyond ordinary perception, a trace of the family's suffering that the world around them could sense but not fully understand. The restorer and historian worked together, comparing the details in the photograph with the written record, trying to match shadows, postures, and expressions with known events. Every anomaly in the image now seemed to align with historical accounts. The slight tension in the mother's hand, the way she held the surviving twin closer than customary, the distant look in the father's eyes, all reflected the emotional strain hinted at in letters and clippings. The twins' expressions, once merely odd or striking in their symmetry, now revealed layers of grief and awareness, as if the child who had died had left an impression not just on memory, but on the photographic medium itself. There was a growing sense that the photograph was more than a passive artifact. It was an active witness, capturing fragments of the family's sorrow, their anticipatory grief, and the echoes of a loss too profound to be articulated. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the way the photograph seemed to defy the linearity of time. The shadows that had emerged during restoration, the small distortions in posture, the twins' knowing expressions, all of it suggested a simultaneity that went beyond the simple moment captured by the camera. The photograph had recorded the immediate scene, but it also seemed to carry a resonance from events that would soon unfold. It was as if the camera had foreseen the tragedy, or at least absorbed its weight in advance, leaving traces of loss in the material that only modern restoration could reveal. Each new historical discovery confirmed this suspicion, layering the photograph with both human and spectral significance, merging fact and unspoken emotion into a single, haunting artifact as the historical context of the photograph slowly came into focus. The emotional resonance of the image began to settle over everyone who studied it, a weight that seemed almost tangible, pressing against the mind and the heart. What had once been regarded as a simple family portrait transformed into a profound document of human sorrow, its subtleties and shadows carrying the grief of a household that had endured tragedy more acute than most could imagine. The restored photograph revealed details invisible to the untrained eye. The parents' hands, once believed to be tender and protective, appeared to grasp at something beyond the children's physical presence, almost clutching at memory itself. The faint curl of the mother's fingers suggested an attempt to hold not just her living child, but the absent one, to preserve what had already been lost. A desperate effort to anchor herself against the current of grief that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. The father's expression, equally composed at first glance, took on new meaning under the scrutiny of the restored image. His eyes, deep, set and solemn, seemed to harbor a mixture of pride, sorrow, and fear, an unspoken recognition of loss that no words could convey. The corners of his mouth, tight and straight, now suggested a suppression of emotion, a disciplined restraint forged from love and obligation. The restored photograph had captured, with an unerring eye, the duality of human endurance and despair, the way grief can manifest not in overt gestures, but in the smallest of details, the tilt of a head, the tension in a hand, the subtle shift in posture. It was an emotional landscape, hidden within a moment frozen in time, waiting for someone with the skill and patience to uncover it. The twins themselves carried the heaviest burden within the image. Their expressions, once thought merely neutral or slightly cheerful, now appeared to radiate awareness of the absence that would soon define their lives. One twin, slightly taller than the other, stared directly into the lens with an intensity that seemed beyond comprehension, eyes reflecting the faintest glimmer of sorrow, as though the child somehow sensed the impending loss of their sibling. The other twin, a subtle step behind, mirrored the first, but with an expression that conveyed confusion, vulnerability, and the dawning realization of grief that had yet to arrive. The emotional power of their gaze was amplified by the faint distortions revealed during restoration, minute shadows in the eyes, imperceptible lines around the mouth, a tension in the neck that suggested a burden heavier than childhood should bear. It was the sort of expression that lingers in the mind, haunting even when the photograph is long put away, because it contains a truth about loss that is impossible to articulate in words. The photograph's impact on those who viewed it in its restored form was profound. Historians, photographers, and casual observers alike reported a strange, lingering unease, a sensation that they were not merely looking at an image, but peering into the emotional fabric of a family's tragedy. Some spoke of a quiet heaviness settling over them, a sudden awareness of how fleeting and fragile life could be, how sorrow could permeate the smallest, most innocent moments. The restored details, the subtle shadows in the background, the nuanced expressions, the tension in the hands, were not just visual anomalies. They were emotional fingerprints, remnants of grief captured with such precision that they transcended the boundaries of time. The photograph had become a conduit, allowing observers to feel, however briefly, the unspoken anguish of a family that had lived and lost more than history had recorded. The sense of emotional intensity was further amplified by the background shadows and shapes revealed in the restoration. Faint outlines behind the family, previously invisible, suggested figures that might have been present, but unacknowledged, perhaps representing memories, absent children, or the presence of grief itself lingering in the air. These ethereal forms were not immediately recognizable as people or objects, but their suggestion of being, their subtle intrusion into the scene, made the photograph pulse with a life beyond the static image. Observers could feel the tension radiating from these shapes, the weight of sorrow pressing down, coloring the entire composition with a muted, spectral melancholy. It was as though the photograph had absorbed the emotional essence of the household, preserving it not in words or diaries, but in visual resonance, a testament to grief made manifest through light, shadow, and nuance. The emotional impact was heightened further when one considered the context of the time. In the late 19th century, death, especially among children, was tragically common, yet it was rarely acknowledged openly. Grief was constrained by social expectation, hidden behind polite faces and formal gestures. The photograph, therefore, was not merely a portrait but a subtle act of expression, capturing sorrow in ways that words could not. Every detail, the faint furrow of a brow, the tension in the shoulder, the tilt of a head, served as a silent record of emotion, a means for the family to express grief while still adhering to the rigid conventions of the period. In this light, the restored image became both a historical document and a deeply moving testament to the human capacity to endure sorrow silently, leaving traces that only the careful eye and meticulous restoration could uncover. For the restorer, the experience of uncovering these emotional layers was nearly overwhelming. Each session with the photograph became an act of intimate discovery, an immersion into the private world of a family long gone. The restored details were not just technical triumphs, but windows into feeling itself. There was a sense of responsibility, too. The knowledge that revealing these subtleties carried weight, that it was not enough to restore the visual clarity of the image, but necessary to honor the emotions captured within. The emotional resonance of the photograph was delicate and profound, demanding care, empathy, and patience from those who engaged with it. Over time, the photograph assumed a presence of its own. It was no longer merely a record of likenesses, but a living testament to grief and love intertwined, capturing a moment when sorrow was already beginning to seep into the fabric of the family's life. Observers reported that the more they studied it, the more they felt the weight of anticipation and loss, as if the very fibers of the image had absorbed the emotional turbulence of the household. The restored photograph revealed not just what the family looked like, but what they felt, preserving traces of despair, vulnerability, and the quiet, unspoken recognition of mortality in a way that no written record could match. The small details, the hands, the expressions, the shadows, combined to create an emotional intensity that resonated across time, transforming a once ordinary family portrait into a haunting document of the human condition. A mirror reflecting sorrow, love, and memory. By the time the photograph had been fully restored, and all historical context unearthed, those who studied it began to sense that it was something far beyond a mere family portrait. The unearthed shadows, the expressions of grief in the twins' eyes, the subtle tension in the parents' posture, all of it coalesced into a presence that was almost tangible, a quiet but insistent awareness that the photograph had preserved more than likenesses or memories. It was as if the image itself had absorbed the sorrow, the anticipation of loss, and perhaps even a fragment of whatever unseen forces had shaped the family's tragic fate. Observers described a feeling of being watched, a delicate pressure that seemed to emanate from the photograph's surface, subtle yet impossible to ignore. It was no longer just a historical artifact. It had become a conduit to something that existed just beyond the boundaries of human perception, a fragment of reality intertwined with the spectral, where grief and memory coalesced into a haunting presence. Those who had examined the photograph closely began to notice other peculiarities. Small shadows that had first appeared as indistinct shapes behind the family now seemed to hold form and intent. Faint lines suggested movement, the subtle hint of figures that were present in the space without ever being noticed at the time of the original exposure. The twins' expressions, always the most arresting element of the photograph, seemed to shift slightly when viewed under varying light, their eyes reflecting something beyond human emotion. A knowledge of absence, a connection to the twin who had vanished, and perhaps an awareness of the observer themselves. The parents' hands, already tense with grief, seemed to clutch at more than just their children. The fingers appeared to anchor invisible presences, lingering spirits or memories, as if the photograph itself had become a repository not only of emotion, but of the souls touched by tragedy. The more time historians and restoration experts spent with the image, the clearer it became that the photograph had captured something that the family had never intended to preserve. It was not merely a record of an ordinary moment in 1880. It was a silent witness to grief, trauma, and a loss so profound that it seemed to imprint itself physically upon the medium. The realization brought a new layer of unease. If the photograph had recorded sorrow, anticipation, and perhaps even unseen presences, then the photograph was more than a passive artifact. It was an active participant, a bridge between past and present, the living and the departed. Every observer became acutely aware of the tension frozen in the frame, as if the emotions of the family were spilling outward, reaching across the decades to resonate in the hearts of those who dared to look too closely. It was in the subtle distortions and anomalies that the photograph's true power was revealed. The shadows behind the parents and children were never identical on multiple viewings, always slightly shifting, always hinting at motion. The twins' eyes appeared to follow observers around the room, a perceptual trick compounded by the faint reflections within the emulsion. Yet the effect was so unnerving that it felt almost sentient. The restored image, coupled with the historical knowledge of the twins' disappearance, gave these details an almost conscious weight. It was no longer enough to interpret the photograph as a document of grief. It demanded acknowledgement of what it carried, a recognition of the lingering echoes of loss, of presence, and of a family whose tragedy had left indelible marks not only on memory, but on the material world itself. The emotional response to the photograph became more pronounced with each viewing. Observers reported feelings of sadness that were almost disproportionate to the image itself, a deep empathy born of connection to the grief captured so vividly. Some described a sensation of vertigo, as though the emotional density of the image pressed outward, intruding on the mind and stirring a sense of unease, a subtle fear of the unknown. The parents' expressions, the twins' gazes, the faint shapes lurking in the background. They coalesced into a tableau of human suffering and awareness that transcended conventional understanding of photographs. It was no longer about the historical record or the accuracy of restoration. It was about encountering the remnants of life and death preserved in a medium that had inadvertently captured more than mere light and shadow. At this stage, even seasoned historians and restoration experts began to question the nature of what they were observing. Was it simply coincidence, a combination of technical anomalies and psychological suggestion, or had the photograph captured something beyond the ordinary? Something imprinted with the weight of sorrow and absence in ways modern science could not explain. The meticulous alignment of shadows with historical accounts of the twins' disappearance, the tense positioning of hands, the depth of expression in faces that had appeared simple at first glance, all suggested intentionality, or at least an echo of reality that reached beyond what could be explained through conventional means. The photograph had become a kind of evidence not only of history, but of a reality that hovered between the visible and the invisible, a silent, potent witness that demanded acknowledgement. Those who experienced the restored photograph could not remain emotionally neutral. Some found themselves revisiting the image repeatedly, driven by fascination and an almost compulsive need to decode its details, to understand what had been preserved so long ago. Others, less able to bear the weight, stepped away, unnerved by the sense of being drawn into the photograph, as if the grief of the family were reaching across time to touch those who looked too long or too closely. It was the photograph's emotional fidelity that made it extraordinary. It preserved not just likenesses, not just historical context, but the resonant grief, fear, and absence that surrounded the family, capturing the invisible traces of loss that lingered long after the living had vanished. In the end, the haunting realization became unavoidable. This photograph, innocent and simple at first glance, had recorded more than anyone could have anticipated. It had documented human sorrow, familial anticipation of loss, and the invisible imprints left behind by a tragedy that had occurred more than a century ago. The restored details, once invisible, had unlocked an emotional reality that persisted across time, turning a seemingly ordinary family portrait into a vessel of haunting resonance. Those who observed it became aware that the photograph was not static. It was alive in its own way, carrying the weight of grief, memory, and perhaps even unseen presences, leaving anyone who encountered it with the inescapable sense that what they were seeing was not simply an image, but a fragment of life and loss preserved in a way that was far more intimate, powerful, and chilling than any ordinary photograph could ever be.